Well, good afternoon, everyone. Your Royal Highnesses, ladies and gentlemen, let me say just to start that it's a great privilege and a great honor for me to be conducting this conversation with Mr. Annan this afternoon. I am personally immensely grateful for the fact that you've come to Copenhagen to talk about the book and really talk about the themes that are engaged in the book. And they are really the big themes that occupy the international community today. And those are some of the themes that we're going to talk about this afternoon. What we're going to do is we're going to conduct a conversation between Mr. Annan and myself, and then we will take questions from the audience, where hopefully we will be able to see you, which we can't really do right now. The book really is a account of the Secretary General's time as leader of the UN, but very much also a discussion of the big themes, whether it's peacekeeping or the Middle East, or development, or Africa. And we want to touch on some of those themes in our conversation and in the question and answer session as well. But why don't we start with the beginning, perhaps? And the first chapter of the book is called African Beginnings. And this is, of course, a story of a beginning in Africa for the Secretary General, but also the evolution of the continent over these last many years, an extraordinary evolution. But perhaps you could share with us a little bit about your beginnings and the Africa that you came from.
Thank you very much, Nader, and I'm also very pleased to be here this afternoon to talk about the book. And I think perhaps Africa is a good place to begin. As most of you know, I was born in Africa and spent my most formative years there. And it was a peaceful Ghana, a peaceful society. We had lots of laughter. We had large family units. It wasn't sort of an immediate family of 2, 3, 4 people. Usually, when Africans talk of a family, it can be quite large as 100 or more, with cousins, aunts, friends, and close relatives. So in my house, grandmother's house and my father's, we always had people to talk to seek advice, to laugh with, to joke with. And so one was never really alone. We did things. And of course, at a young age, I went to boarding school. You came to visit me.
I did.
Not when I was in boarding school.
No,
but
a little later.
Visited, And I went to boarding school, and I grew up at a time when the struggle for independence was going on. And as young people, we followed this discussion of freedom, democracy, independent Africa very intensely. And in fact, we played roles. I was seen as a leader of the opposition amongst my group, and there were others who played the role of a leader of the governing party. And we followed the incredible political intensity of the country. And as you grow up watching this, and suddenly you achieved independence, which brought on incredible changes of Ghanaian Prime Minister, Ghanaian head of the army, Ghanaian police commissioner, and all along the line, you realize change was possible, even very radical change. And this is something that really marked me throughout my life, that I like to push the envelope. I like to challenge. And you may remember sometimes in New York when I suggested we do something, and some of the advisors said, it can't happen, it's never been done. I would always say, test it, let's test it, and you'll be surprised what you find. So I still, at this age, I still go around testing and pushing the envelope. Africa, of course, in the meantime, has gone through a whole host of changes. My country got its independence in March 1957. The same year, Malaysia got its independence. They got the independence in August 1957. And on the 50th anniversary of both countries, I had the good fortune of being asked to speak in both countries at the independence anniversary. And I couldn't help compare the situation of the two countries. When we achieved independence, we were almost at the same level of development, the same amount of national reserves at the bank, and yet the GDP of Malaysia was 13 times higher than that of Ghana. And then you ask yourself, how do you explain that? And it boils down to a question of governance. Ghana went through a series of military coups d'etats, whereas Malaysia had a stable government. Of course, Mahathir stayed for about 20 years, but it was stable, and they continued developing, and they also had a consensus of the direction the nation should move in. With us, with the political changes, since that consensus wasn't there, each time you had a new government, they started from afresh. You brush aside what the previous government had done, so you did not have something to build on. And this really caused problems. And we had similar situations in other parts of Africa. But today, we have better governance. We have active civil society developing, keeping the politicians honest. We have educated young men and women who have worked and studied abroad in Europe and America, who are going back to make a difference and are determined to have a better life and to help develop the continent. Today, there are fewer civil wars on the continent than there used to be. We are seeing major investments in Africa. We have new investors, the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, Malaysians and Indonesians. The Europeans and the Americans, who've been the traditional partners, have been a bit on the sidelines in some ways, warning Africans to be careful of the Chinese. But I tell them that's not the way to do it. Compete with the Chinese and offer the Africans a better model and use the knowledge and the experience you have of Africa to put it to good use. And I think they are beginning to do that. And I really think Africa is on its way. The years of big men leading countries are over. And I would encourage investors to look at Africa very critically as the next continent.
I think this ties to one of the themes in the book, which is the question of trade and aid. And Denmark, obviously, is a major aid donor historically, but also today. How do you think for Denmark as a donor to Africa, how should it think about the balance between aid and trade? And there's been this debate that aid is in fact a deadening factor, is destructive to the kind of initiative. Yeah. But what is the right balance, do you think, to be struck?
I think first of all, no country can develop through development assistance alone. I think development assistance and aid should be used to build capacity and to strengthen institutions. Most governments, most countries would want to stand on their own. They would much rather trade themselves out of poverty than rely on assistance. And in fact, I had a study done when I was Secretary General through UNDP to look at how we deliver assistance and in a sustainable sort of way. And one of the studies indicated that it might be more helpful to develop small and large-scale companies, industries, that will employ local people and make it sustainable. And several governments are looking at this approach now, and I think it will bear fruit. So one should look at supporting small and medium-sized companies. One should look at supporting perhaps Danish companies investing in Africa, giving them some sort of guarantees or insurance to encourage them to do that. And I'm happy to say that several countries I've spoken to are looking at this model.
Okay. We have
of course, Ghana and Denmark have had very long relationship. Some happy, some not so happy.
I was going to leave that out for now.
But we all share Christiansborg.
Exactly.
We have one in Accra too.
That's right. We have a number of big themes, but I think one theme that we'd love to hear your thoughts about, which does really go through every dimension of the book, is this idea of intervention. I mean, the English, US, and British title of the book is Interventions. And it's really a theme that I think goes back to your entire career at the UN, but very much as Secretary General, coming into the role and very much having the view that you wanted to see the UN in a more active, in a more intervening role, one that cared more and was able to act more. This is often seen through the prism of conflicts and military intervention, but there's a broader theme here that I think characterizes your time and which we talk about in the book.
Yeah. No, absolutely right, because what we should be about at the end of the day is improving the condition of the individual, the welfare of the individual. And that can be done through containing conflict and wars. It can be done by lifting them out of poverty. It can be done by ensuring that they have health facilities. And you see it when you travel around. My wife Nan is here, and we used to travel around. And in fact, I used to be very jealous of her program, because we go to a country, and I go from the airport to the hotel, to the meeting, to the airport, and back again. And she goes to the villages, visiting women's programs, schools and others, and then we compare notes at the end of the evening. And I wish I had her program. But in the process, you discover we share the pain and the agony of the people. I recall we were in Guatemala or Bolivia, where a family came to see us with a 9-year-old, and they said she has AIDS. We can't afford medication. She's going to die. Can't you help us? So Nader discussed it with me, and we said, why don't we call the UNICEF representative to see if they could help? They managed to get her medication, but she died. A year or two later, we got the message. She was an example of millions around the world in that situation. And so what do you do? The UN launched the Global Fund to fight HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis, because the medication was there, but the poor couldn't afford it. And when you visit the hospitals, and we were in Mozambique, we visited Mother to Child hospital, where they did a skit trying to convey the message of the disease to their kids. And you knew that there was medication that could save this. And they look at you in the eye, almost saying, can't you help me? I know I can be saved if I had money. So when we set up the fund, I decided to go further and invited chairmen of the 7 largest pharmaceutical companies to a meeting in Amsterdam to discuss how we can make the medication available to the poor. And it was a critical intervention, because at that time, the medication cost 15,000. It cost 15,000 per person. There's no way the people in the third world could afford this. So I engaged the companies and said, could we reduce the prices? Because if you are not able to do it, you're going to have problems. You cannot protect your intellectual property. You cannot ask the international system to work with you in defending your intellectual property when a life-saving drug is available, but the poor are allowed to die because they couldn't afford it. So we have to find a way of doing it. It was one of the most interesting meetings I had, because the first chairman to speak up said, I don't know why I'm here. My lawyer is not here. And I said, this is not a question of lawyers. He said, no, I could be accused of price fixing. I said, price fixing is when you collude with others to increase your profits. Here I'm asking you to lose money. I'm asking you to cut back. So you're not there. And at that time, by the way, they were suing Mandela in a South African court because he had threatened to use a generic version of the medication to treat his people. So I advised them, I said, look, find a way of cutting the prices, but don't pursue this case with Mandela in a South African court. I said, I'm not a public relations expert, but if you go and sue Mandela in South Africa on an issue of HIV/AIDS. If you lose, you lose. If you win, you lose and lose and lose. So you better, in the end, they resolve it out of the court. But I give this to indicate it was a massive contribution from 15,000 to 150. Today we have millions people on the medication that could not have afforded it. And we've also raised 220 billion to help those living with the disease. We did the same in terms, again, the individual on Millennium Development Goals, the fight against poverty, coming up with certain basic requirements that we should try and drive to ensure that every individual has it, whether it's primary education, clean water, and all that. And these goals were so simple that the people understood it, the governments understood it, and the people could press their governments to deliver. And in places like Brazil, China, India, millions were lifted out of poverty. And even the smaller countries have done quite a bit on clean water, on education, on health. And so we continue. And of course, there is military aspects which people tend to focus on, which is not really the whole essence of intervention.
But if we just stay with that dimension, we'll get to another theme in a moment, but a very important theme of your time was this question of when is it right to intervene, and how should the international community think of the rights and the responsibilities of leaders towards people living in their own countries. And this is something you started talking about very early on in your Secretary Generalship, which of course culminated with the Kosovo conflict and others, and then ultimately with the idea of a responsibility to protect. How did you see that evolution, and what did you bring from your experience from head of peacekeeping during the Rwanda genocide, the Bosnia wars, that made you prioritize that?
Actually, those were very difficult periods. It was a difficult period for the UN and the international community, but it was also a personal journey for me. A personal journey in the sense that I lived through the crisis in Somalia as in the peacekeeping department, where millions were starving. We managed to get in food, but couldn't get it to the needy because a group of, I wouldn't call them radicals, really criminals, were preventing the food from moving from the warehouse to those who needed it. So President Bush Sr. decided, on the advice of the Council or request of Secretary General Boutros-Ghali, to send in US troops to ensure food got to the needy. So thousands of US... 91, 92, Thousands of US troops went in. It was then transformed into UN peacekeeping operation. And we had an incident. A US plane was shot down. They were going after one of the warlords. And the bodies of the troops were dragged through this capital city of Somalia, Mogadishu. So the US decided to withdraw. And almost all the Western countries withdrew with the best equipped troops. In the end, the operation collapsed, and we left Somalia. And the international community forgot Somalia for about 20 years, until it came back to bite us. We dismissed it as a failed state, and it came back to bite us as a center of piracy. And suddenly, Somalia was on the map again, and everybody was talking of Somalia. Then Rwanda followed, where 800,000 people died with a small UN force on the ground, and we couldn't do much. At the same time, we were into Yugoslavia, and similar experience, particularly with Srebrenica, where 8,000 young men were marched out and killed. And so, as an individual going through this heart-wrenching and painful experience, you kept wondering, what can we do? What do we do if we have another Rwanda? How do we react? Could we have done more? And in fact, it was that challenge that I placed before the General Assembly in 1999 speech, asking them, what do we do if tomorrow we are confronted with another Rwanda. And that was the genesis of this responsibility to protect. That led to a commission by the Canadians to look into this whole question of humanitarian intervention. When the report came out, we distributed it liberally, but I decided to wait until the timing is right to pose the issue of protection. And that moment didn't come till 2005 at the summit, where I recommended that the member states should accept that no country, that governments, that each individual government has a responsibility to protect its own people from genocide, from crimes against humanity, systematic and gross abuses of human rights. And if that government is either unable or unwilling to do it, then the international community, in the form of Security Council, can intervene to assist the victims. The implication of that norm is that governments, as of that date in 2005, could no longer hide behind sovereignty and brutalize their own people. And that those of us outside that country also do not have an excuse not to act. We cannot say we don't intervene in internal affairs, that some crimes are so shameful, so unacceptable, that we have to act. And that is how we came by this question of responsibility to protect. Most people tend to think it implies military action, but no. Military action can be resorted to as a last resort. I think one of the best intervention on that basis was the one in Kenya 5 years ago, when after the elections and the parties got into a conflict, where in a relatively short time, 1,300 people were killed, 650,000 were uprooted. I and two other panel members, Graça Machel, the wife of Nelson Mandela, and President Ben Mkapa, former president of Tanzania, were asked to go in to help. And the international community worked with us very, very effectively. The African Union, the UN, the European Union, US, everybody was there, and we applied all sorts of diplomatic and political pressure to end the killing and to get them to accept a settlement and a program of reform, which led to a new constitution 2 years ago. And 5 years on, they've had elections without violence, with contentious results, but still without violence. The case is in court, and I think that's a vindication of this R2P.
Good. Let me turn to a theme that's on, I think, lots of people's minds today, because it is the 10th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. I don't think it's something that's celebrated, but it's something that's marked. And I think that there are lots of questions around this. This was very much a crucible of your own leadership of the UN. And for the institution, of course, the entire period of the run-up was a very difficult one. The follow-on from the invasion, and really, certainly the most difficult time of your Secretary Generalship, the killing of 22 of our colleagues in Baghdad in August of 2003, including Sergio Vieira de Mello. Maybe before we talk about perhaps the lessons of this war for today, give a sense of your personal experience of that period and that time. What impact did it have on you, the difficulty to face the UN, what it meant to our own people who were there? How do you recall that experience today?
It's interesting to go back. The whole question of Iraq war started as a slow-moving sort of train, and then it accelerated. I think one has to go back to 9/11, when the buildings, the towers were brought down, the shock, the anger. And on that day, and the weeks thereafter, the whole world were with the US. The US got lots of support and handled differently that support and friendship will probably still be around. Not soon after that, I remember Newsweek doing a piece, and the title was, "Why Do They Hate Us So Much?" And I called the editor and I said, "Interesting piece, but I would have put on a different title. What went wrong? How did we lose these friends around the world? What did we do?" And I think the decision to declare war on terror, to lash out, the fight in Afghanistan or going after the Taliban was understood. I think most members in the UN supported that. But when it became a broader war, an impossible war on terrorism worldwide, even then the UN and I myself came up with a plan where member states could cooperate to contain terrorists, to deprive them of their opportunities, to ensure they are not given haven, they do not allow them to use the financial system and all that. Then that transformed into attention on Iraq. First attempts were made to link Saddam Hussein with the terrorists, which was a lie. Which was a lie. Then the question of arms cache came up, that we need to go to Iraq to get rid of the weapons. By then, the inspectors were out then, but we managed to get them back in. So Dr. Blix and Dr. El Baradi were doing their work and needed a bit more time. But President Bush and the coalition were in such a hurry that they wouldn't give the inspectors time. This brought very serious divisions in the organization. And I was at the center calling almost every leader, from Latin America to Africa to Asia to Europe, and with Bush and Tony Blair also. In the end, some of us were hoping that they will not do it because we felt they needed a resolution of the Security Council, that most people accepted that when a country is attacked, it had the right to defend itself. But when it came to a question of broader security for all of us, you cannot do without the legitimacy of the Security Council. And I personally was also concerned that if US can decide to go and get rid of a government it doesn't like for one reason or the other, what precedent does it set? Could Russia and allies do that? Could China and allies do that? What sort of a world are we going to create?
Well, and the question, I remember you asking the coalition in the run-up, and obviously Denmark has had a very important role in the operations, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been very much an issue for this country. But you were asking in the weeks and months running up to the war, when it became clear that this was very much a real possibility, you would ask them, what happens when the bombing stops?
Exactly.
Right? There's a lot of talk now, and it has been the last 10 years about, oh, well, we didn't expect that this could unravel, we didn't expect the insurgency, we didn't know this could happen. But you were asking them before, what happens when the bombing stops? And they didn't have much of an answer. It brings one question. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Do you think they were deceiving others, or do you think they were deceiving themselves? Particularly Bush and Blair. And this was supposed to be a friendly interview.
Yeah. No, that is the question. Let me, I have this attitude about betrayal. I say to betray a friend, you first have to go through self-betrayal. So to deceive others, you have to also start by deceiving yourself. But you think you would win in the end. You think it won't catch up with you. You think in the end, everything will go all right. And I think some genuinely believed that they will be received with flowers and music and dancing. Most of us, or I didn't. No country, no people want to welcome an occupier. You may be welcome for the first couple of weeks. Soon you become an occupier, and everybody turns against you, particularly when they also question the legitimacy and the basis for the action. But I think in Washington, definitely, a group had decided it's time to get rid of Saddam. And we're looking for excuses to go in. And there was a sense that during the first Iraq war in 2001, they should have gone on to Baghdad all the way. But I attended an event in Kuwait, the 20th anniversary of that war. And all the key players were there, Jim Baker, Colin Powell, and others. And discussing with Jim Baker said, well, Kofi, this is a war we fought right. We stuck to the Security Council resolution. We did not stray 1 inch. We managed to gather the best and largest coalition ever and get others to pay for it. What else could you want?
Exactly. We're going to start taking questions in a moment. So those are questions, if you could start thinking about them. I'm going to ask one more, which does come back to Iraq in one way, but really to the question of what it means to be the Secretary General of the UN. And that is that you don't have the luxury of choosing who to deal with. And when you came back from your first mission to Baghdad in '98, you'd been on a long flight coming back. You were exhausted, I think it's fair to say. And a journalist said to you after you'd had your meeting with Saddam, is Saddam someone you can do business with? And you said, yes. Yeah. Essentially saying, this is what I just did.
Exactly.
That was held against you then and has by some people ever since as a way of saying that you were willing to do business with mass murderers and criminals. How do you manage that balance? And even personally, when you're sitting across the table from people who have, in some cases, been responsible for great crimes, how do you justify that to yourself and to the role?
Yeah. First of all, I don't go and see these leaders to chit-chat and drink a scotch or have tea with them. I go with very specific objective. Often it is to save lives. Often it's to improve a hopeless situation. When there's a conflict and you want to make a difference, I mean, often we talk of peace and justice. The first thing you need to do is to stop the killing, is to try and attain some stability, and then the justice can follow. I agree, you need justice, but the first effort, and you have to speak to those who can make a difference in stopping the killing. You have to.
That's the people responsible for it.
Often this is the people responsible for that. And even before I got to this stage, you would recall I was very keen on the establishment of the International Criminal Court, because we had a legal system where if a man or a woman killed one person, they were likely to be brought to court, to be brought to trial and held accountable. But if they killed thousands, they got away scot-free, because often they were political leaders or big generals that nobody went after. So you were putting into place pegs and limitations. And when you go and speak to these people, they ask you, first of all, they also are waiting for you. They sometimes, almost invariably, try to put their best foot forward to show you they don't have horns. They are human, which you know they are not, because they couldn't have done all the things they've done. Yeah. But you engage them and try to reach them and look for an opening where you can get them to pull back or shift and do what is right. Incredibly, some seem so meek and gentle and friendly, laughing as if they haven't done any of the things that they do. For example,
when you meet them in person.
When you meet them in person. Yeah. I mean, in the conversation with Saddam Hussein, he was very calm, very soft-spoken. He wasn't using the arms the way they do in the region. And even halfway through the conversation, he said, Mr. Secretary General, would you excuse me? I have to go and pray. So he left to pray, and I said to myself, well, if he's still praying, then there's a hope. And after he had left to pray, I turned to his, the interpreter, because there were only 3 of us in the room. Am I getting through to him? He said, yes, yes, yes. Because he didn't want to be bombed.
And he said, keep going.
Yeah, he didn't want to be bombed either. Yeah. In any case, we managed to delay the bomb from February till end of the year, but at that time it did come. But it was good to do it. Or Assad, who will sit and tell you straight that I have the support of my people. I wouldn't be here after a year of conflict if they did not support me. Or what you are watching on television is virtual reality. And let me tell you what Syria is about. And really sitting there discussing it with a straight face and ostensibly believing what he was saying, and also convinced that he's going to prevail, and trying to push him to negotiate, to talk, to do this.
We might get a chance to come to the questions here. So we have a little time for questions. If you would raise your hand, and I will be blunt enough to say that please do ask a question and not make a statement. So with that warning, why don't we take a question in the very back, I think, corner.
Hi. Hi, my name is Reviok. I'm from Greenland. I'm wondering if the United Nations could improve their financial structure somehow. Some claim that the larger states and corporations have too much power. So, yeah, that's a question.
I think the question was around whether you reform the UN because corporations and states
have too much
power relative to citizens and people.
I think one of the things that we've noticed in recent years is the emergence of robust civil society in individual countries and the network of civil societies that work together to maintain pressure on governments, on other centers of power, and to ensure that people do have a say. I think the question of a relationship between corporations and governments is something that each individual country is dealing with. And I know perhaps this question is much more relevant today in Europe than it would have been 3-4 years ago. I've had the chance to talk to people, ordinary people, some who have lost their jobs. And the sense is that corporations have lots of power. Governments listen to them and pay attention to their needs and ignore the needs of the ordinary people. Because the attitude is, if I were not able to pay school fees, the government or the city council will tell me, we can't help you. If I can't do certain things, they said, we can't help you, we have no budget. And suddenly, with the crisis, the same governments found billions to save banks and to help other institutions. You cannot tell the ordinary people that it's important for the credit to continue flowing, and credit is like blood in the system. And therefore, one had to make sure these institutions did not collapse. And of course, the logical ones would ask you, if you say it's too big to fail, is it also too big to succeed? And this sense of abandonment by the government makes these type of questions even more important. The attitude is the big boys look after themselves. But I think the best way to tackle is for each government to have the right regulatory system to ensure that what has happened doesn't happen. And there are discussions about reforms, which unfortunately has slowed as economics begin to improve. Yeah. But reforms are necessary, and I think the banks and the corporations should support these reforms, not fight it, as some appear to be doing. But I think at the end of the day, power still rests with the voters and the people. And if the voters and the people have an issue, which is important, they should push it up the political agenda, and the government and the parliaments would take the right action.
Okay. There's a question right there.
Thank you, good afternoon, and I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Anka Danabab, and I have a question for you, Mr. Annan. In Rwanda happened, to some extent, if I know correctly, because of Mogadishu, because President Clinton didn't want another episode of Mogadishu. We had then Darfur, and then we are now having Syria. It seems to me, Mr. Annan, that the world does not learn its lessons. So my question is, what kind of reforms do you see necessary to the UN system to help this world learn its lessons or getting better at it? Thank you.
You raised the question of the UN learning its lessons. The UN is also the member states. And I think you started your question rightly by saying that it started in Somalia, Rwanda, Darfur, and that President Clinton didn't want to take any risks. In fact, not only did they not want to take risks, they came up with a law, PDD 25, saying that the US troops will not take part in UN peacekeeping operations. And if a country as powerful as the US is holding back because it doesn't want to take risks, you can imagine the attitude of other countries, from Denmark to others, going to take risks in a situation where a powerful US is afraid to go. So then you have a situation where the response is either meek or absent. And in some situations, unfortunately, the international system puts in responses which we know are not adequate. You mentioned Darfur. Darfur, the initial approach was to get the African Union to put in the troops, and we knew they didn't have the capacity. I myself organized a pledging conference to support that force in Addis. We had very important countries around the table, from the US to the European countries. China was there. No. Almost everyone promised to everyone offered strategic airlift. Strategic airlift means we will fly the soldiers to Darfur. That's the easiest part. That's the easiest part, and demonstrate what is important is to sustain them day in and day out for 5-10 years, to make sure they have equipment, they are supplied, they have mobility, they have helicopters. Nobody would offer them. And so in the end, to make sure the operation didn't collapse completely, I came up with an idea of what we call the hybrid force, that the UN forces will team up with the African forces and the UN will pick up the tab. That was the only way we could sustain the operation to help this Sudanese. And so I think the lesson that we need is for the member states to understand that peacekeeping is not a risk-free operation. And for them to explain to their population that it will entail risk, and we are prepared to take it for the sake of humanity. You would notice when it's a peacekeeping operation, the governments don't want to take any risks. If it's a national deployment, the US took thousands of casualties in Iraq. They took thousands in Afghanistan. In Somalia, 16 soldiers were killed and they were out. If we approach peacekeeping and collaborative effort this way, we will never be able to really do what you're suggesting we do. And I recall when the US troops were pulled out, I was in the peacekeeping department. And I said, the way the US troops have pulled out has created the impression that the easiest way to disrupt a peacekeeping operation is to kill a few peacekeepers and everybody leaves. And when this happened in Rwanda, and 10 Belgian soldiers were killed and the Belgian troops were withdrawn, and somebody asked a Rwandese soldier, why did you do this? He said, we also watch CNN, was the answer.
Just a quick follow-up on this. I mean, do you think, in many respects, on following on this question, that Rwanda paid the price for Somalia? Is Syria paying the price for Iraq? Do you think the world would have reacted differently had we not gone through the experience of the Iraq War?
Yeah, I think definitely Rwanda paid the price for Somalia. It was under the shadow of Somalia. And here in Middle East, in Syria, there are two issues. We have the experience in Iraq, which is just next door, which has never been stabilized.
Even today there are bombings.
Even today there are bombings. And then we have Libya, which also came just before Syria, where the Russians and the Chinese believe that they had been deceived, that they did not veto a resolution to send in a resolution to help the people of Libya, to help the people of Libya. And that they were deceived in the sense that they felt that resolution was turned very quickly into regime change. And Gaddafi was removed. I mean, I'm not holding any brief for Gaddafi, but I'm telling you this was their attitude, and this had complicated the relationship with them over Syria. Even when I raised the question of arms embargo for Syria, they said this is another Libya, beginning of Libya. So you had Libya, you have Iraq, which has really complicated the situation in Syria. And also you have an American president whose agenda for the moment seems to be quite domestic, and also sees himself as a president who's bringing the boys home.
And ending wars.
End wars, and is not going to take on another war. Whether the European nations will step in and fill the void, I do not know. But I must say in Lebanon in 2006, where we had to put troops in southern Lebanon, the Europeans provided the backbone of the force, and they really stepped up to the plate. The US was not welcome, but Europe did it.
Okay, right in the middle there. Yes. I think you need a mic. Do you have a microphone? Maybe there's a microphone coming your way.
He's an opera singer. He said he can speak up.
Thank you. What do you consider your greatest personal failure as the Secretary General of the UN?
Greatest personal failure? No, I think one of my biggest disappointment, and I think we've touched on it, was our inability to stop the war in Iraq, which I was really opposed to with every vein in my body, believing, knowing or feeling it was absolutely wrong. And I put in lots of effort, lots of phone calls, lots of discussions, and really felt it was something we had to avoid. And we failed. I really took it as almost a body blow. It was a very painful experience. Of course, we see the results. It's a sort of situation where people say you were right. You don't want to be right. I wish we had not broken it. Now we've broken it and we can't really put it together.
Yeah, at the side there.
I wonder what can be done in the UN system, especially in the Security Council, to assure that people speak the truth. What I'm thinking about is that everybody remember that we saw Colin Powell before the Iraq War speaking in the Security Council about the weapons of Iraq. Nuclear weapons, biological weapons, mass destruction weapons, and about the connection to Al-Qaeda. And we wondered, is this a truth? Now we know this was not true.
Well,
in the court, you have to tell the truth. You should wonder.
I think we have
can
the
you
question.
can you do something to make sure that people there tell the truth?
Yeah, let me react to your question. I think that was one of the tragic events in the sense that the existence of weapons of mass destruction was the basis for the war. But let me say that, yes, Colin Powell made a powerful presentation to the Security Council, but that presentation did not convince the Security Council to vote for the war. The Security Council did not authorize the war. And in fact, if there had been a vote from my own private count, the US probably would have got 4 votes out of the 15. And so the Security Council did. People outside the council may have taken a different view, but the council analyzed the situation and came to the judgment that we cannot support this war. And in effect, the council and the system worked the way it should have. The fact that the US and its allies went outside the council and took action that I've described as illegal and illegitimate is something else. And they are the ones who have to answer for their actions. And I think history is going to judge this Iraq war very harshly.
But this is also complicated for you by personal relationships. So we describe in the book how Colin Powell came to you after the US found the mobile labs.
Yeah.
And he came in and he said, Kofi, they've made an honest man of me. And what he meant by that is we finally found the evidence. Which of course turned out not to be evidence of it.
Case.
But in the case of someone like him, do you think, how do you explain, because he seems to a lot of people to have been someone caught in a very difficult situation. How would you characterize his role? Was he being a good soldier? Was he deceiving himself? How would you?
No, I think one has to look at the US political system. In the American system, American political system, it is very rare that people resign. The only resignation that people my generation can remember on issues of principle in American politics was a Saturday night massacre when Cy Vance and a group of them resigned. Otherwise, it's a very rare phenomenon. In fact, some people put it down to the power of the military-industrial complex that is so powerful that you're going to need them. And so you don't quit and you don't resign on issue of principle where they see you as an unreliable person and nobody else will take you in.
So what you're saying is in another system, Colin Powell would have resigned?
Well, let me go on. And on top of that, Colin Powell is also a general and a soldier.
Yeah.
And soldiers play by team and mission, and you stick together as a team. Whether the possibility of resignation crosses his mind or not, I don't know. But he operates in a system where you don't resign. Maybe in another system, he may have. I don't know.
Let's see. There, the gentleman right there. Yeah.
You have some few hands in the front.
Okay.
Mr. Annan, thank you for coming to Copenhagen today and for sharing your thoughts with us in this book. Could you tell us, based on your experience as a Secretary General and based on the challenges that the world is facing today, what is a major skill or the most important skill that a Secretary General should have? Thank you.
He's my friend, you know. No, I think the Secretary General at all times should be open. He should have an open mind. He should listen. He should have a good team around him. He should have a good judgment. He should have a sense of humor, internally and externally, including sometimes laughing at himself. And above all, he has to have that empathy and compassion for his fellow man and woman and bear their interests in mind. But he should also have ability to convince, to persuade others, and particularly the big countries, to do the right thing or to curb any excesses they may be inclined to.
Let me add to this, since I can be a little less modest than you are. I think one of the things, and I saw this in the very first trip I took with you, which was actually to Denmark, in 1997. And what I saw was a prime minister who met you, who had not met you before, who didn't know you. And what I saw, and I think this is when I'm asked about Mr. Annan's leadership, I think this is a lesson that I certainly took away from, and looking at other leaders, is your ability to convince others that your success was in their interest.
Yeah.
And that made a huge difference. And
That's
it was
it.
a big contrast with your predecessor, I can say that. But it made a very big difference, I think, to your success. Was there a question in the front here? Yes, please.
Yes, I would like to know, do you think that normal or traditional warfare is the best way of fighting terrorism?
Can you put it up?
Yes, do you think that traditional warfare is the best way of fighting terrorism? And do you consider Denmark a winner? We have the last troops in Afghanistan now, they are going back, and do you consider us a winner?
Well, that's the fight against terrorism has raised many issues. It has raised issues about trade-off between civil liberty and the fight against terrorism. Some governments use the T word almost as a license to do whatever they want, and that is wrong. Sometimes they are almost demanding their people to understand that in the fight against terrorism, civil liberties and human rights may be trampled upon, but that's okay, trust me, we are protecting you. I don't believe in that. When you're asked to give up your civil liberties and your human rights for protection, and you do you in the end have protection when your rights are on the line? I mean, there are lots of things happening today, and what the program we came up with the UN about fighting terrorism focus more on governments working together, sharing intelligence, not providing haven for the terrorists, going after them with intelligence and picking them up. And maybe we did this because we have no army. But fighting terrorism with a traditional warfare and army, you have lots of collateral damage. Lots of innocent people get killed. And of course, talking about this, I'm now also beginning to I'm very worried about the new warfare using drones. I mean, today the US has monopoly over drones. Other countries are going to develop their own drones, and perhaps even better ones. What are the rules? Can anyone take to the air and kill somebody in a country that they are not at war with? What sort of world are we creating? What should be the rules? And this whole idea of targeted assassination, where you kill somebody because you suspect he or she was going to do this or that, or maybe planning, when the person is dead, has no possibility of answering, what sort of system are we putting on? So we need to think very seriously about all these things before it becomes free for all, and other people develop drones, and we start going after each other in all sorts of places, which is part of the answer to your question of using military means to fight terrorism. Where they are concentrated, given, for example, take Mali, where they came in from Libya, tried to take Mali, and then went into a northern hideout, and they are concentrated, and it's almost a state of war. That is different. But the way it's going, we can hit people in countries which are not at war, and in fact, sometimes we may not even admit we did it.
Okay, time for a couple more quick questions. Let's take right here in the middle here. If you just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I would like to know, who do you consider the biggest player when it comes to change in a country where the government is oppressing its people? Is it the international society with the UN member states, or is it the people of the country? And can they do without each other?
I have no doubt in saying that it's the people of the country. But sometimes they need to be encouraged. They need to be supported. And the international system and people outside the country can help. You know, it's almost like a schoolyard thing when you see somebody bullying a group of children and others. A third party saying, stop, this can't go on, you know, can have incredible impact. So outsiders saying, you are right to be fighting for your freedom, to fight for democracy, but the outsiders cannot come and impose it. It has to come from the people. And we sometimes make mistakes thinking outsiders can bring it in. They can't. It has to be the people, and they need to be supported and strengthened to do it.
But one of the things that's interesting about this age is that you see how technology is changing this dynamic. And you can see in countries that are repressed, outside providers can provide technology that allows people to organize and demonstrate without being caught by the government. And so, and private players can play more of a role too.
Yeah, no, they can have it, but then you have another problem in the sense. Let's take the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring, they use the internet as a tool to organize themselves to come out and do this. And people call it an internet revolution. But really the internet was a tool, and the weaknesses has also shown that real leadership, cohesive leadership, was missing.
The strength of the Arab Spring was that it was a leaderless revolution.
Leaderless,
the weakness is that
exactly.
it's a leaderless
Revolution. Yeah. And you have, and when you have that sort of fluid situation, it's always the organized who emerges on top. And here the best organized was the Muslim Brothers, and they came up on top. But they are also new to government. They've never governed before. And they are taking over a whole country, and they are struggling. And yet they cannot touch some experienced people who work with the old government because they are tainted. So everybody is floating. And the economic and social situation in Egypt is very difficult. Tourists are not going. Companies are downsizing or relocating or closing down. Police have not been able to assert themselves. And it's a very difficult situation. And the Chinese one in '89, on the other hand, was what I call a fax revolution, because the tool then was a fax. The students were sending faxes to each other. I was listening to reports on BBC, but the best reports we got was two UN staff members who had apartments in Beijing overlooking the Tiananmen Square, and they were sending fax telling us what was happening, you know. And so the tools will give you the information, but you need the leadership and the judgment to mobilize it and move forward.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and the lady right here.
Mr. Annan, when you look back at your career and your experience, what advice would you give to yourself as a young Kofi Annan?
As a young Kofi Annan?
Yes.
Go for it.